I have a really enjoyable Sunday school lesson for you. This is something or a story that I've really enjoyed over the times, and I think you will all enjoy it. We're first going to start with the place of where this story begins. So this starts in a place right beside the Mediterranean Sea, or the Medo-Persian Empire. And so this was a place that's actually pretty far away, and that's where the story took place. And there was a man named Darius, who was a king, who had administered many different types of people in the place. And he had allotted Daniel, a man named Daniel, to administer over this place. Now, Daniel was very distinguished, or he was very different than the rest of the people. He was a very intelligent man. And you can see Daniel here on the left. And Daniel was a man of God. He was someone who had followed after God. He had sought God's ways every day. He had prayed every day. And so he was a man who was dedicated towards God. But many people were quite intimidated by Daniel. And Daniel was so smart that many people were a little bit jealous. Here was a man, Daniel, who was a man of God, and yet many other people had looked up to him. And so many of the other people were kind of jealous of who Daniel was. And so they had sought out to try to find a way to, find fault or find something that's wrong with Daniel, but they could never find anything. And so many times what they tried to do is they would look and watch his every single step. And you can see here someone's kind of peeking around the corner. They were looking to find something that was wrong with Daniel. Every step that he made, they were looking to find if there was something they could find fault with Daniel. Why? Because they were jealous of who Daniel was. And one day when they were following Daniel, they had saw that Daniel was praying to God, to his own God. And they knew that this was not allowed in the land that they had lived in. And they saw him and he was praying every day and every night. And so they got together, they saw him praying, and every day they would watch him. He would go in, he would pray, and then he would go out. And many people had conspired. They thought, that's interesting. We see Daniel, he's praying to his own God. And so this caused a lot of trouble for Daniel. But Daniel was faithful towards God. And so the group of the men, the administrators at that time, they went to Darius, and they came before him and they said, "Long live Darius," because Darius was considered a king at that time. And at that time, people weren't allowed to worship anyone but that king. And so they thought to themselves, well, what we're going to do is we're going to say that if anyone prays to anyone but Darius or worships anyone but this man, then they're going to be judged. So Darius sat there and he thought to himself, he says, that sounds like a great idea. I'd love if people bowed down and worshiped me. And for the next 30 days, I don't want anyone to bow to any other god, and I want them to bow before me. Now you should remember that there's only one God, and that's the God of heaven. And Darius was not a god. And here he was trying to ask people to bow down before him. And so Darius was a man who had thought of himself as a god, but he wasn't a god. He wasn't the God of heaven. And so what they did was they actually made this a law. They said, if anyone bows down to anyone else but myself, then they will be persecuted or they will be punished for it. And so that's what they wrote in their law. But Moses, sure enough, the next day, he had prayed to God. He didn't care what the law was. He said, I know the one true God, and that's the God of heaven. He's the living God. And Darius, the king, is not a god. And so he had prayed once again, 3 times a day he prayed to God, the living God, because he had a relationship with him. And it's important to remember that many other people, they pray to things that aren't living. They have objects sometimes that they pray to. but they don't move, they don't live. But yet, here was Daniel. He was praying to a God who was a living God. But then all of a sudden, as Daniel was praying, of course, all the men that saw him, they were very upset because they were watching his every move to see if he would pray to his own God. And so they looked out and they saw there was Daniel on his knees and he was praying to the real God. And they thought, we got him. Now that we see him praying, we're going to bring him to Darius and he's going to be persecuted for that. So the men, they brought him to Darius. And Darius was troubled because Daniel was a good man. And he didn't want him to be punished at all. But Darius had signed that law that if anyone was to pray to anyone else but himself, that he was going to be judged. And so sadly, Daniel was arrested. He was brought before Darius. And Darius was going to judge Daniel. Why? Because he prayed to the living God. And so they brought Daniel to this massive pit. And you can probably see it there in the picture. There's the pit. And they brought Daniel before the pit. And inside the pit were lions. And what they were going to do was throw Daniel into this pit. And assumingly, Daniel was not going to survive. And so they threw him in the pit. And here's Daniel. You can see he's being thrown in. And then they covered the pit with a rock so that Daniel could not get out. And so here was Daniel with the lions. But the next day, Darius conscience got to him. And so he ran outside because he wanted to see what had happened to Daniel, because Daniel was a good man and he was close to his heart. And so Darius had asked for that stone to be removed away, and he asked for it to be removed, and he looked down and he called out for Daniel. He said, "Daniel, are you there?" Now this is a really remarkable part of the story, because here was Daniel found with a den of lions. And you can see in the picture that the lions had not eaten Daniel at all. Strange. This was considered a miracle or something that was supernatural, not normal to happen. You'd think that lions, they would eat anything that they could. But God had preserved Daniel. He had saved Daniel from the den of lions. And then Daniel was taken outside of the den of lions and he was cared for. And so the story is a beautiful story because it starts with a man who had prayed to the living God. Many around him had accused him. He was thrown into a den of lions, and yet God had saved him. Why? Because he had faith in God. And so I want to share this verse with you. It's a verse that's found in Daniel, and it says this: "So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him," not even a scratch. The lions did not do anything. Because why? Because he had trusted in his God, the living God. Remember, Darius, although he had asked many people to bow down before him and to pray to him, Daniel knew that there was a living God, a God in heaven who could save him. And there's a few verses that I want to look at with you as we close this Sunday school lesson, and I really hope you enjoyed it. There's two verses. One, it says, "There is salvation in no one else, for there is no name," that is the Lord Jesus, because he's the real God, "under heaven given among men, which we must be saved." In other words, each one of you are in a problem. You can think of Daniel. He was found in a problem. He was found in the lion's den. And we also have a problem because we have the problem of sin. And sin is something that we all deal with. And God says that sin is going to be punished. And so we need to be saved from our sin. And it says here in Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of salvation to everyone who believes." You see, Daniel was a man of prayer, but Daniel more importantly was a man of faith. He had trusted God. And likewise, if we're to be saved, we need to trust the Lord Jesus to save us, just as he had saved Daniel. And so I hope we all really enjoyed this lesson together. It's a very good lesson. It's a lesson about God saving individuals. And it's always good to remember that God is the one who can save. We can't save ourselves, just like Daniel couldn't save himself, but we need to trust God to save us. So I hope everyone enjoyed that lesson.